Commander Vextar stood before the massive holographic display in the command center of his flagship. The blue light cast strange shadows across his angular features as he studied the tactical information floating before him. Numbers and calculations filled the air around him like digital snow. Each piece of data had been analyzed 17 times by the ship's computational systems. Every possible outcome had been calculated and recalculated until only the most probable. Results remained. The Zephyrian Empire had been at war for 347 years. In that time, they had conquered 43 different species across the galaxy. Each victory had been achieved through precise mathematical analysis, an overwhelming application of force at exactly the right moment. They did not believe in luck or chance or intuition. They believed in numbers and logic and the cold certainty of proven tactical doctrine. Vextar touched the display with one clawed finger, and the image shifted to show a small yellow star with 9 planets orbiting around it. The third planet glowed with the blue and green colors that indicated a world with liquid water and oxygen atmosphere. Intelligence reports showed it was inhabited by a species that called themselves humans. Preliminary analysis was complete. Human military technology was primitive by Zephyrian standards. They still used chemical propulsion for their spacecraft and projectile weapons that fired metal bullets. Their largest military vehicles were crude machines that moved on tracks or wheels across the surface of their planet. Their aircraft could not even leave their atmosphere without massive external fuel tanks, not according to the computational analysis. The human military would offer resistance equivalent to what the Empire had faced from the Krellian defense forces. During the conquest of Sector 7, the Krellians had lasted approximately 14 standard days before surrendering. The computers estimated that humans would last between 11 and 16 days, depending on how quickly their command structure collapsed under orbital bombardment. Vextar nodded slowly as he reviewed the final invasion plan. It was elegant in its simplicity. First, the orbital platforms would eliminate all human satellites and space infrastructure. Then strategic bombing would destroy major population centers and military installations. Finally, ground forces would land at predetermined coordinates to accept the surrender of whatever human leadership remained alive. The plan allocated exactly the right amount of resources for the task. Not too many ships which would waste fuel, and personnel. Not too few which might allow unexpected resistance to develop. The mathematical models showed a 94% probability of complete success within the estimated time frame far below on the surface of Earth. Jake Morrison sat at his kitchen table rolling 20-sided dice across a hand-drawn map. Map showed a fantasy kingdom with mountains and forests and rivers marked in colored pencil. Small metal figures stood at various positions across the paper representing knights and wizards and monsters. Jake picked up one of the figures and moved it 3 squares forward toward a crude drawing of a castle. He consulted a thick book filled with rules and tables, then rolled the dice again. The numbers that came up determined whether his character successfully snuck past the castle guards or was spotted and forced to fight. This was Jake's favorite part of the week. Every Friday evening he gathered with 3 friends in his small apartment to play their ongoing fantasy campaign. They had been meeting like this for almost 2 years, creating stories about brave heroes and terrible villains in imaginary worlds. Jake served as the dungeon master, which meant he controlled all the monsters and villains, while his friends played the heroes trying to stop them. As a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, Jake had studied military history and tactical planning for most of his adult life. He had served in 3 different combat zones and earned decorations for leadership under fire. But somehow he found that these weekly games helped him think about strategy and tactics in ways that traditional military training never had. In regular military planning, everything followed established doctrine. There were proper procedures for reconnaissance and rules for engagement, and approved methods for dealing with different types of enemies. The Army had spent decades developing these procedures, and they worked well against human opponents, who followed similar logical approaches to warfare. But in the fantasy games, Jake could try tactics that would never work in real military situations. He could set up elaborate traps and use misdirection and create scenarios where the obvious solution was actually the worst possible choice. His friends had learned to expect the unexpected when Jake was running a game session. Tonight Jake was preparing a particularly challenging scenario for next week's session. He wanted to create a situation where his friends would think they understood what they were facing, but would actually be completely wrong about the real threat. It was the kind of creative problem-solving that made him feel more mentally sharp than any military exercise ever had. The dice rolled across the map again as Jake tested out different possibilities for how the scenario might unfold. He made notes in the margins of his notebook about what would happen if the players chose different approaches. Unlike real military planning, where you tried to predict enemy behavior based on logical analysis, Jake had learned to think like his players and anticipate choices that might not make tactical sense but felt dramatically satisfying. High above, the Earth Zephyrian scout ships moved silently through space, conducting final reconnaissance sweeps. Their sensors mapped human military installations and communication networks with perfect precision. Every radar station and missile battery and command bunker was cataloged and assigned a target priority number based on its strategic value. Scout commanders transmitted their reports back to the main fleet and received confirmation that the invasion would begin in exactly 72 hours. The timing had been calculated to coincide with optimal orbital positioning and minimum human defensive capability based on their current military deployment patterns. None of the Zephyrian officers considered the possibility that their perfectly logical approach to warfare might not be the only effective way to fight. They had won every conflict for over 3 centuries using the same methodical analysis and overwhelming force. The mathematical models had never been wrong before. Back in his apartment, Jake finished preparing his game notes and put away the dice and miniatures. He looked at the fantasy map one more time and smiled at the elaborate scenario he had created. His friends were going to hate him when they realized how completely he had misdirected them about what they were really facing. He had no way of knowing that in less than a week he would be using exactly the same kind of creative tactical thinking to fight for the survival of his entire species. The galaxy was about to discover what happened when an enemy that had mastered the mathematics of war encountered opponents who treated combat like an elaborate game where the most important rule was that there were no rules that could not be broken. The first alien ships appeared in Earth's skies on a Tuesday morning. Jake Morrison was drinking coffee and reading tactical reports when every communication device in his military base started screaming emergency alerts at the same time. Within 6 hours, the base was nothing but smoking rubble, and Jake found himself running through the woods with whatever soldiers he could gather. The attack had been unlike anything in human military experience. The aliens didn't announce themselves, or make demands, or give any warning at all. They simply appeared in orbit and began destroying everything that looked important. Military bases disappeared under beams of energy that cut through reinforced concrete like it was paper. Aircraft carriers sank in minutes when invisible weapons punched holes straight through their hulls. Jake had managed to save 4 people from his unit when the base was hit. Staff Sergeant Lisa Parker had been in the communications bunker when the attack started and had grabbed an emergency radio before the building collapsed. Corporal Mike Chun had been working in the demolitions storage area and had stuffed his pockets with explosives before running for the exit. Diarmando Wells had been visiting from the War College to give a lecture on military history and had been in the parking lot when the energy beams started falling from the sky. They spent the first 3 days just trying to stay alive and find other survivors. The aliens seemed to be everywhere at once, destroying everything that looked like organized resistance. Jake watched through binoculars as perfectly coordinated alien forces moved across the landscape, eliminating human military units with mechanical precision. Every attack followed the same pattern with the same timing and the same overwhelming application of firepower. On the fourth day, they found shelter in an abandoned elementary school building. The aliens had ignored it completely because it had no military value, according to whatever targeting system they were using. Jake spread maps across the floor of a classroom and began trying to make sense of what was happening to his world. Lisa had been monitoring radio traffic from other surviving units, and the pattern was always the same. Human forces would try to mount some kind of organized defense using standard military tactics. The aliens would detect the preparation phase and respond with exactly the right amount of force to eliminate the threat before it could become dangerous. It was like the aliens knew exactly what humans were going to do before humans did it themselves. Jake stared at the maps and the scattered reports and suddenly felt like he was looking at something familiar. The alien attack patterns reminded him of something, but he couldn't quite identify what it was. Then Amanda made a comment about how predictable the alien responses seemed to be, and Jake realized what he was seeing. The aliens fought like the most boring opponents he had ever faced in 20 years of running fantasy games. They were like players who had read every strategy guide and memorized every optimal tactic, but had never learned to adapt when something unexpected happened. They were min-maxers who could handle any situation as long as it followed the standard rules, but became confused when faced with creative solutions. Jake began explaining his theory to the others using terms from their old gaming sessions. Lisa had always played rogues in their Friday night games, so she understood immediately when Jake described the aliens as enemies who had perfect stats but terrible AI programming. Mike had preferred chaotic characters who solved problems through creative destruction, and he nodded when Jake compared alien tactics to computer opponents who always made the mathematically correct choice. Amanda had served as their group's lore keeper and resident expert on military history, both real and fictional. She pointed out that the aliens seemed to have studied human warfare very thoroughly, but only the conventional parts. They knew how to counter tank formations and airstrikes and naval bombardments, but they had no experience with irregular warfare or guerrilla tactics. Jake pulled out a notebook and began sketching what he called a campaign plan. Instead of trying to fight the aliens using traditional military doctrine, he wanted to organize resistance like he was setting up a role-playing adventure. Each person would have a specific role to play and specific abilities that complemented the others. They would work in small groups like adventuring parties and focus on achieving objectives rather than winning battles. The first test came when they spotted an alien patrol moving through the ruins of a nearby town. Standard military thinking would call for either avoiding the patrol completely or setting up an ambush with superior firepower. Jake decided to try something that would never appear in any tactical manual, but that he had used successfully in dozens of game sessions. He called it a false retreat scenario. Lisa would use her radio to send fake distress calls that would attract the alien patrol to a specific location. Mike would set up what he cheerfully called trap rooms using his demolitions expertise to create overlapping zones of destruction. Amanda would provide intelligence support and coordinate timing. Jake would serve as bait to draw the aliens into the killing zone at exactly the right moment. The plan required perfect timing and assumed that the aliens would react predictably to what appeared to be a standard human military situation. If Jake was wrong about their behavioral patterns, then his team would probably die in the next hour. But if he was right, then they might just prove that aliens who had mastered the mathematics of warfare could still be beaten by opponents who understood the psychology of gaming. Lisa began broadcasting emergency signals designed to sound like a human unit in desperate need of rescue. The alien patrol immediately changed course and began moving toward the signal source at exactly the speed their standard response protocols required. Mike finished setting up his improvised explosive devices in a pattern that would funnel the aliens through a narrow corridor where they could not use their superior numbers effectively. Amanda tracked the alien movement through stolen binoculars and provided countdown updates so everyone knew exactly when to execute their part of the plan. Jake positioned himself where the aliens would see him first and began what he privately thought of as the performance of his life when the alien patrol arrived. Jake pretended to be a panicked soldier fleeing from an overwhelming enemy force. He ran in exactly the direction that would seem most logical to someone trying to escape, while actually leading the aliens straight into Mike's carefully prepared trap. The aliens followed their optimal pursuit protocols and walked directly into overlapping fields of fire and explosive devices. The ambush succeeded beyond any of their expectations. The alien patrol was completely destroyed, and Jake's team captured equipment and intelligence that proved the aliens were not invincible. More importantly, Jake realized that his gaming instincts had been absolutely correct about alien psychology. They really did fight like opponents who could only follow programmed responses to standard situations. Standing in the smoking ruins of what had been an alien patrol, Jake began planning bigger and more elaborate scenarios. If small unit tactics borrowed from role-playing games could work against alien patrols, then maybe the same principles could be scaled up to larger operations. Maybe the key to winning this war was not to outfight the aliens, but to outgame them. Word about Jake's successful ambush spread through the resistance networks faster than anyone expected. Within a week, he was receiving radio messages from survivor groups across 3 different states, asking for advice on how to fight the aliens. Most of the messages came from military personnel who had tried conventional tactics and failed badly. They wanted to know how a small team with improvised weapons had managed to destroy an entire alien patrol without losing a single person. Jake found himself in the strange position of trying to explain tabletop gaming tactics to career soldiers over crackling radio transmissions. He started by teaching them to think about aliens the way a dungeon master thinks about computer-controlled enemies in a role-playing game. The aliens had very sophisticated programming, but they were still following scripts that could be predicted and exploited. Amanda had been studying the captured alien equipment and made a discovery that changed everything. The aliens communicated through a complex system that translated their thoughts directly into tactical data and shared it instantly across their entire force. It was incredibly efficient for coordinating large-scale operations, but it also meant that every alien unit responded to situations in exactly the same way because they were all accessing the same tactical database. She compared it to playing against NPCs in a computer game where every enemy of the same type had identical behavior patterns. Once you figured out how one alien patrol would respond to a specific situation, you knew how every alien patrol would respond to the same situation. They were not individuals making independent decisions, but components of a larger system executing predetermined protocols. This insight allowed Jake to develop what he called the player handbook for fighting aliens. Just like the rule books he used for fantasy games, it contained detailed information about different types of alien units and their behavioral patterns. Scout units always moved in formations of 3 and always retreated when they took casualties exceeding 20%. Combat units always established overlapping fields of fire and always called for reinforcements when engaged by forces larger than their current tactical assessment could handle. The handbook also included what Jake called encounter tables that described how aliens would respond to different human actions. If humans attacked from the north, the aliens would execute defensive pattern 7. If humans used vehicles, the aliens would deploy anti-armor protocols. If humans tried to retreat, the aliens would pursue using standard chase algorithms until they reached predetermined distance limits. Jake began training other resistance leaders to use these patterns like game mechanics. Instead of trying to outfight the aliens, they would outthink them by setting up scenarios where the aliens' optimal responses would actually work against them. It was like designing puzzle encounters where the solution required understanding how the enemy's programming worked rather than overpowering them with superior firepower. The first major test came when a resistance group in Colorado asked for help dealing with an alien supply convoy that was resupplying forward bases every 3 days. Traditional military thinking would focus on attacking the convoy with maximum firepower during its most vulnerable moment. Jake suggested something completely different that he called a dungeon crawl approach. Instead of attacking the convoy directly, they would create a series of encounters that would force the aliens to make increasingly poor tactical decisions while believing they were following optimal protocols. The first encounter would be a fake ambush designed to fail in a specific way that would make the alien escorts more confident. The second encounter would be a successful attack on what appeared to be the main target, but was actually a decoy. The final encounter would trap the real convoy in a situation where their standard response protocols would lead them directly into a kill zone. Lisa coordinated the communications between different resistance cells to make sure everyone executed their part of the plan at exactly the right time. Mike provided technical expertise for creating convincing decoys and realistic-looking threats that would trigger the appropriate alien responses. Amanda analyzed intelligence reports to predict exactly how the alien convoy would modify its route and timing based on the earlier encounters. The operation unfolded over 5 days like a carefully scripted adventure scenario. The aliens responded to each encounter exactly as Jake's behavioral models predicted. They increased security after the fake ambush. They adjusted their route after the decoy attack. They called for additional support when they detected what appeared to be a major threat to their primary objective. Every alien decision seemed logical and appropriate from their perspective, but actually moved them closer to the trap Jake had designed. By the time they realized what was happening, they were completely surrounded in terrain that negated all their technological advantages and facing an enemy that had anticipated their every possible response. The convoy was completely destroyed, and the resistance captured enough alien technology to equip 12 different cells with advanced weapons and communication equipment. More importantly, they proved that Jake's gaming-based tactics could be scaled up to major operations involving dozens of people and complex multi-stage plans. Commander Vextar reviewed the battle reports from the convoy attack with growing confusion. His tactical computers could not explain how primitive human forces had managed to coordinate such a sophisticated operation. The humans seemed to have predicted every aspect of alien response protocols and prepared countermeasures for tactical decisions that had not even been made yet. The computer analysis suggested that humans possessed intelligence gathering capabilities far beyond what initial assessments had indicated. Either they had captured and decoded alien communication systems, or they had developed some form of predictive algorithm that could anticipate Cypherian tactical doctrine. Both possibilities seemed unlikely given human technological limitations. But the evidence was undeniable. What disturbed Vextar most was that the human tactics made no mathematical sense. They had sacrificed numerous tactical advantages for no apparent strategic gain. They had chosen attack methods that were statistically less likely to succeed than conventional alternatives. They had allocated resources in patterns that violated every principle of optimal force deployment. Somehow these irrational choices had combined to create a devastating defeat for forces that should have been invulnerable to human resistance. It was like facing an enemy that won by deliberately making wrong decisions in a way that somehow added up to the right result. Jake stood in the ruins of the alien convoy, reading captured intelligence reports that confirmed his theories about alien psychology. They really were like opponents in a game who could only respond to situations they had been programmed to handle. The key to beating them was not to get better at playing by their rules, but to change the rules entirely and force them to play a game they did not understand. He began planning what he privately called the boss fight scenario that would test whether these tactics could work against the alien command structure itself. The success of the convoy operation changed everything about the resistance movement. Jake found himself coordinating with survivor groups across the entire continent as word spread that humans had found a way to consistently defeat alien forces. Military officers who had been trained in conventional warfare were now asking a guy who ran fantasy games for advice on tactical planning. It would have been funny if the fate of humanity hadn't depended on it. The aliens noticed the change too. Commander Vextar began receiving reports of increased human resistance activity that followed patterns his tactical computers could not predict or counter. Human forces were using coordination methods that seemed to anticipate alien responses, while employing strategies that made no logical sense according to established military doctrine. The mathematical models that had predicted easy victory were becoming increasingly unreliable. In response, the Zephyrian Command decided to adapt their approach by studying human military history more carefully. Teams of alien analysts began reviewing centuries of human warfare, looking for patterns they could use to predict resistance behavior. They studied everything from ancient battles to modern conflicts, searching for the underlying logic behind human tactical decision-making. Jake realized what the aliens were doing when captured intelligence reports started showing references to human military leaders like Napoleon and Patton and Sun Tzu. The aliens were trying to understand human warfare by analyzing historical examples, but they were completely missing the point. The resistance wasn't using historical military tactics at all. They were using gaming principles that had no connection to real warfare except in Jake's imagination. This gave Jake an idea for what he privately called the Grand Campaign, just like the epic adventure scenarios he used to plan for his Friday night gaming group. This would be a coordinated series of operations designed to tell a complete story from beginning to end. Each individual mission would seem like a separate event, but they would all connect to create a larger narrative that the aliens couldn't see until it was too late. The plan required perfect timing and coordination between resistance cells scattered across thousands of miles. Jake would need to convince dozens of independent groups to execute specific operations without knowing how their missions fit into the larger strategy. It was like running a massive role-playing campaign where each player only knew their own character's part of the story. Amanda developed a communication system that solved the coordination problem in a way that was both brilliant and completely insane. Instead of using military terminology that the aliens could intercept and decode, they would coordinate using references to fantasy literature and gaming culture. Resistance fighters would receive mission orders disguised as discussions about imaginary adventures and fictional characters. Lisa tested the system by broadcasting what sounded like casual conversations between fantasy game enthusiasts. She would talk about planning a campaign where the players needed to collect 3 magic artifacts to defeat an evil overlord. Anyone listening would think they were just discussing a game, but resistance leaders understood that it meant 3 separate operations needed to be completed before the final assault could begin. The aliens' translation systems could convert the words into their language, but they had no context for understanding what humans meant when they talked about character, classes and dice rolls and dungeon encounters. The resistance had essentially created a command language that was invisible to alien intelligence gathering because it was based on cultural references that didn't exist in alien society. Jake began implementing the grand campaign by organizing resistance cells according to classic adventure party structures. Each group had members who specialized in different roles, like scouts and fighters and support specialists. The missions themselves were designed like encounters in an epic quest, where each success provided resources or information needed for the next challenge. The first phase involved what Jake called gathering the party. Resistance cells across the country began recruiting new members and establishing supply networks, while conducting small-scale operations that seemed unrelated to any larger strategy. The aliens observed increased human activity, but could not determine what the resistance was preparing for, because each individual action appeared to have purely local objectives. The second phase was collecting information and resources through operations that Jake described as side quests. Resistance groups began targeting alien installations that contained specific types of equipment or intelligence, rather than simply trying to inflict maximum damage. The aliens noticed that human attacks were becoming more focused, but they interpreted this as improved coordination rather than preparation for something bigger. During the third phase, Jake initiated what he called the main storyline. Multiple resistance cells began executing coordinated operations designed to force the aliens to redeploy their forces according to predictable response patterns. Each human attack was carefully planned to trigger specific alien countermeasures that would position their troops exactly where Jake needed them for the final confrontation. Commander Vextar watched the tactical displays with growing alarm as human resistance activity escalated across multiple sectors simultaneously. His forces were responding appropriately to each individual threat, but somehow the humans seemed to be anticipating every countermeasure and had prepared secondary operations that exploited the defensive redeployments. It was like fighting an enemy that could see several moves ahead in a game whose rules kept changing. The breakthrough came when a resistance team, led by Mike Chun, successfully infiltrated an alien communication facility using what Jake called a classic heist scenario. Instead of trying to destroy the facility, they focused on accessing the alien communication network long enough to insert false information into their tactical database. The operation combined elements of stealth missions and puzzle solving that the aliens' security protocols had never been designed to handle. The false information convinced the alien command that the resistance was planning a major assault on their primary base in the former ruins of Chicago. This triggered a massive redeployment of alien forces to defend against an attack that would never come, while leaving their actual strategic targets vulnerable to the real operations Jake had been planning all along. Amanda coordinated the final phase from a hidden command post using radio equipment that had been salvaged from a dozen different sources. She watched as resistance cells across the continent executed their individual missions at precisely timed intervals, while alien forces rushed to defend against threats that existed only in their manipulated intelligence reports. The climax came when Jake led a small team in what he described as the ultimate boss fight. Using intelligence gathered during earlier phases of the campaign, they infiltrated the alien command ship that had been left vulnerable by the false redeployment. The mission succeeded not through superior firepower, but through creative problem-solving and the kind of improvised teamwork that Jake had learned from years of collaborative storytelling. As alarms sounded throughout the massive alien vessel, Jake realized that they had accomplished something that shouldn't have been possible according to any conventional military analysis. They had defeated an enemy with superior technology and overwhelming force by treating warfare like an elaborate game where the most important victory condition was changing how the game was played. Inside the captured alien command ship, Jake stared at displays showing information that changed everything he thought he knew about the invasion. The Zephyrian Empire was not the unstoppable military machine it appeared to be from the outside. Their entire command structure was built around mathematical analysis and predictable responses. But this efficiency had created a critical weakness that no one had ever exploited before. Amanda worked frantically at an alien control panel, trying to decode the flood of data streaming across the screens. The ship's computer systems contained detailed records of every military campaign the Empire had fought for the past 3 centuries. Every victory had been achieved through the same methodical approach of analyzing enemy capabilities and applying overwhelming force at precisely calculated points of maximum vulnerability. What made the information so shocking was that the aliens had never faced an enemy like humans before. Every species they had conquered had responded to invasion with logical military tactics that could be analyzed and countered through mathematical modeling. The Zephyrians had become so dependent on their computational approach to warfare that they had no backup plans for dealing with opponents who made decisions based on creative thinking rather than tactical optimization. Lisa established communication with resistance cells across the globe and began transmitting the intelligence they had captured. The alien command network was completely open to them now, and they could see exactly how the Empire's forces were deployed and what their response protocols were for different types of threats. More importantly, they could access the psychological profiles that alien analysts had developed about human behavior and see how completely wrong they were. The aliens believed that humans were simply using more sophisticated versions of conventional military tactics. Their analysis teams had concluded that the resistance success was due to superior intelligence gathering and advanced coordination capabilities, rather than fundamentally different approach to strategic thinking. They were trying to counter human tactics by developing better mathematical models when the real problem was that humans weren't following mathematical logic at all. Jake realized that this misunderstanding gave the resistance an opportunity that might never come again. Instead of trying to defeat the Zephyrian Empire through military force, they could win by introducing enough chaos and unpredictability into alien operations that their command structure would collapse under the weight of its own inflexibility. Working with Amanda and the other resistance leaders, Jake developed a strategy that he described as winning by changing the genre of the conflict. Rather than trying to outfight the aliens, they would focus on creating situations that the alien tactical computers simply could not process or respond to effectively. They would turn the war into a type of story that the aliens had never encountered before. The plan began with resistance cells around the world conducting operations that prioritized confusion and narrative satisfaction over tactical advantage. Teams would rescue prisoners who turned out to have crucial information about alien weaknesses. Groups would form alliances with other conquered species by offering them character development opportunities rather than traditional military partnerships. Fighters would consistently make strategic choices that prioritized long-term story development over short-term tactical gains. Mike led a series of what he called side quest missions that seemed to accomplish nothing important from a military perspective, but created mounting psychological pressure on alien commanders. His teams would attack installations that had no strategic value, but were symbolically important to alien culture. They would rescue alien prisoners and treat them well before releasing them with messages about human intentions that made no sense. According to standard diplomatic protocols, the psychological effect on Zephyrian officers was more devastating than any conventional military defeat could have been. Commander Vexstar found himself receiving field reports that described human behavior as strategically incoherent but operationally effective. His tactical computers could not generate reliable predictions about human actions because the resistance kept making choices that violated every principle of rational decision-making while somehow achieving their objectives anyway. The breaking point came when resistance forces began conducting what Jake called redemption arc operations. Instead of simply fighting alien forces, they started trying to convert individual aliens to their cause by demonstrating that cooperation produced better outcomes than conquest. Some aliens began questioning their orders and requesting transfers away from Earth assignment. Others started providing intelligence to human forces in exchange for what they called philosophical discussions about the nature of warfare and creativity. Vextar realized that his forces were not just losing battles, they were losing their fundamental understanding of what warfare was supposed to accomplish. Human tactics had introduced variables into military equations that his computational systems had no way to process. The mathematical models that had guaranteed victory for 3 centuries were becoming meaningless when applied to opponents who treated conflict as an improvisational art form rather than an optimization problem. The final phase of Jake's strategy involved what he called campaign resolution. Resistance cells stopped trying to inflict maximum damage on alien forces and instead focused on creating scenarios where aliens could choose to withdraw with dignity rather than face continued exposure to tactical situations that made no logical sense. It was like offering players an alternative ending to a game that had become too frustrating to continue playing. The war ended not with a climactic battle, but with something that resembled the conclusion of a long-running role-playing campaign. The Zephyrian Empire didn't fall through military defeat, but through strategic paralysis. Their command structure had been optimized for efficiency and logical decision-making, but proved completely unable to function when faced with opponents whose strategic choices were guided by dramatic satisfaction rather than tactical optimization. Commander Vextar found himself in the unprecedented situation of requesting permission to withdraw from a conquest that should have been completed months earlier. His reports to the Imperial High Command described humans as a species whose military capabilities could not be accurately assessed because they operated according to strategic principles that had no basis in conventional warfare. The recommendation was to classify human space as an anomaly zone and avoid future contact with a species that seemed to treat serious military conflict as some form of elaborate entertainment. Jake Morrison returned to his small apartment and set up miniatures on a hand-drawn map for the first gaming session he had been able to organize since the invasion began. Lisa and Mike and Amanda joined him along with several new players, including some very confused alien refugees who were still trying to understand how tabletop gaming related to military strategy. As Jake rolled dice to determine starting conditions for their new adventure, he reflected that sometimes the most powerful weapon against a perfectly optimized system was the willingness to play by completely different rules than anyone expected. Earth became known throughout the galaxy not as a military power, but as a world of strategic innovators whose approach to conflict was so fundamentally different from established norms that it defied conventional analysis. The phrase "pulling a human" entered galactic military terminology, meaning to solve a strategic problem through creative interpretation rather than optimal calculation. And somewhere in the galaxy, other species facing Zephyrian expansion began organizing their own resistance movements armed with translated copies of fantasy gaming rulebooks and a new understanding that sometimes the best way to win any game was to change the rules that everyone else was playing by.